What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to celebrate the 75th anniversary of The Thing from Another World, which was released on April 6th, 1951, and I have it right here on Blu-ray. But the movie was based on the novella Who Goes There by Jown W. Campbell Jr., which was first published in Astounding Science Fiction in August of 1938. The story would later be expanded by about 45 pages or so into a full-length novel, but I have a copy of the original novella right here, and I highly recommend it, especially if you're a fan of John Carpenter's adaptation from 1982. But more on John Carpenter's interpretation later. For now, let's stay focused on this movie, which was one of several movies that helped kick off the sci-fi craze, or the sci-fi boom of the 1950s. Because for years, science fiction had more or less been confined to magazines and comic books. But in the 1950s, the genre really took off on the big screen. And some of these movies were amazing, some were dreadful, some are a charming mix of both. But The Thing from Another World still packs a punch 75 years later.
The Thing from Another World. This is the spot where it was first seen, and these are the first people who saw the thing. How did it get here? Where did it come from? What is it?
That thing's alive, sir. I saw it. I shot at it. I hit it. I know it. Nothing happened. It just kept coming at me, making a noise like a cat mewing. Captain, it was awful. If you could have seen those hands and those eyes. Captain, you've got to do something about it. You've got...
But what I find really interesting about 1950s science fiction movies is there's so much like fear and anxiety and paranoia about a great many things. Like obviously the atom had just been split, and we'd just seen the atomic bomb in action in World War II. So people were terrified about atomic energy and atomic weapons. But we started getting our first UFO sightings. So people were terrified about UFOs, but they were also terrified about the spread of communism or the spread of rock and roll or whatever the case might be. But it was just an era that was defined by a lot of fear and anxiety. And you can feel it in all the science fiction movies, especially The Thing from Another World. But in this movie, some of the scientists are portrayed in a positive light, and some of them are portrayed in quite a negative light, where it's like, thank God we got a few muscle-bound pilots and engineers and former soldiers to kind of keep them in their place, because otherwise they might just wreak havoc on all civilization and allow this thing to spread its seed, quite literally, all across the face of the planet. I rewatched the movie a few times getting ready for this video, and I'm more impressed by it than ever before. But the main reason I wanted to do this video was that it opens the door to discussing the career of Howard Hawks on this channel, a filmmaker I've been obsessed with for decades. He produced this movie and gave his frequent editor Christian Nyby his first shot at directing, and ever since then, fans of the movie have been debating to what extent can Howard Hawks' fingerprints be felt on the final product. And if you want to skip ahead to that debate, I include a few arguments on both sides, and I'll include a time code below. And I'll also include a link to a two-part podcast I recorded a few years ago where I tackled the entire career of Howard Hawks from start to finish. I've seen every movie that he ever made. Like I said before, I'm obsessed with the career of Howard Hawks, and if you ever want to read the definitive guide or the definitive comprehensive tome to his entire career, Todd McCarthy has you covered with the Gray Fox of Hollywood. And if you don't like the book, well then you can always use it as a weapon to bludgeon people to death if they disagree with you on your opinion of Howard Hawks. But I think the best way to get going with this video is to discuss my first encounter with the story of The Thing, because back in the early 80s, my dad and my uncle were giant movie freaks, and my uncle actually owned a video store in the early days before they all started kind of getting bought up and consolidated. But he had a Laserdisc player and a pull-down screen, and he and my dad were obsessed with screening this double feature where they would watch Walter Hill's The Warriors, followed by John Carpenter's The Thing. And for whatever reason, they just liked watching those two movies back to back. And so as a little kid, I saw those movies over and over and over again. We'd order Domino's Pizza, and I would love The Warriors, but then The Thing, it was so terrifying to me as a little kid that I couldn't even really experience it as a movie. It was just like a nightmare that I was experiencing in real life. It had a massive impact on my imagination at that time, and I still think it ranks among the greatest horror sci-fi hybrids ever made in any era. And the good news is, if you're a fan of that movie, you don't have to pick and choose between the original Thing from Another World and The Thing, because John Carpenter is probably the biggest fan of this movie who's ever lived. And years ago, I don't know how I found it, I came across a commentary track that he recorded that at that time was available on YouTube, and now I can't find it. But he recorded a commentary track for the original film, and you basically get to hear the horror master turn into an 8-year-old child in real time, because as he's watching it, he kind of forgets to do official analytical commentary or talk about film history or his own career. And he just starts watching the movie, and he'll have 10 or 20 minute periods where he kind of forgets to talk, but you can tell that he's just been sucked in by the movie. He's fallen under its spell all over again. But it was a fantastic commentary. And if you want to appreciate just how intensely John Carpenter admires his original movie, check out the title card for the original film from 1951 versus his title card from 1982. Apart from a little color, there's not much difference, apart from the fact that the earlier film also includes Howard Hawks' production of The Thing. And the original movie was just supposed to be called The Thing, but there's a pop song that came out right around the same time, and they were so worried about the movie getting confused with or affiliated with the pop song Howard Hawks at the last minute added From Another World, which is why in all the posters you see From Another World, written really small, and it's kind of almost like an afterthought, but it just is a way of kind of making a distinction between the two movies. It's just easier now to say The Thing from Another World. But if you read the story Who Goes There throughout the entire text, because they don't really know like what to call this thing or have a name for it. So throughout the text, Campbell's constantly making references to the thing, like the thing slouched down the hall, the thing absorbed the dog, or the thing did this, or the thing did that. So it's only natural that the movies would be called The Thing, because for whatever reason, they did not want to use the title Who Goes There. But before diving into the movie with both feet, let's talk a little bit about the short story, because there are a few ingredients that have never been captured in any of the subsequent movie adaptations, but there's certain scenes that carry over across all the various interpretations of the text. But there's one ingredient that I really liked in the short story where the creature or the thing has a little bit of like telepathy where you don't even quite know, is it like on purpose or is it just by a natural byproduct of being near the creature? But like when the creature's frozen in that block of ice, and it's amazing how well both Carpenter as well as the Hawks production capture all these scenes. But when the creature is still frozen, the people that are looking after it and kind of sitting near it, they start suffering from nightmares, and they start gaining information about it just by like osmosis, just through the proximity to the creature. It's like, you know what, that is really cool, because in the short story they have a very finite amount of time to get all the information across and all the exposition across, and a lot of these scientists and pilots and engineers and so on and so forth, they all start leaping to these conclusions very quickly, and they finally realize they're actually gaining information from the creature. But the creature looks quite different in the original short story. As they try to capture with this little illustration, he's got 3 red eyes that are described as being like, full of pure malice. And he's got these little wavy kind of blue hairs like little tendrils or snakes. But he only appears in his original form once or twice, because obviously he's always trying to transform into dogs or transform into people. And even though I've been rewatching John Carpenter's adaptation my entire life at this point, I remain incredibly impressed by that film, because having now read the original novella, I see just how great an adaptation it truly is, because some of the best scenes in the movie come right from the text, like the scene where they're testing each other's blood and realizing that each little drop of blood of the creature is not a drop of blood of the original creature. It becomes its own independent life form, and it'll try to survive, and it'll try to escape, and so on and so forth. It's just brilliant stuff, but it all comes from the text. But because we wouldn't have either of these amazing movies without this original source material, I want to pause for a moment and read one passage that perfectly captures the moment where the creature starts emerging from the ice for the first time. And it really comes across like a great excerpt from a story by someone like H.P. Lovecraft. And I think it's unfair to call this story Lovecraftian, even though you can tell it's very heavily influenced by a story like At the Mountains of Madness. And actually, before I read this, let me also pause for a moment to say, if you like The Thing from Another World, or The Thing, or Who Goes There, and you like the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, you've got to play the role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, which has gone through 7 editions at this point. Here's the starter kit for 7th edition, and I'm playing it right now with some of my friends. But to be more specific, we're playing Pulp Cthulhu, which is basically like a spin-off from the original Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, where it adds a few more pulp ingredients. But when you watch The Thing from Another World or The Thing by John Carpenter, they're like the perfect embodiment of everything cool about that role-playing game. But if you ultimately end up pulling the trigger and start playing that tabletop RPG, you got to get the Call of Cthulhu Investigator's Handbook and Keeper Rulebook to get up and running, and obviously you need a few friends to play with. But we're having a blast with that game, because it opens the door to rereading all this great old short stories by H.P. Lovecraft, and rewatching The Thing from Another World only fan those flames even higher. But here's the passage from Who Goes There that I want to include. The beast had been thawing for nearly 18 hours now. He poked at it with an unconscious caution. The flesh was no longer hard as armor plate, but had assumed a rubbery texture. It looked like wet blue rubber glistening under droplets of water, like little round jewels in the glare of the gasoline pressure lantern. Conant felt an unreasonable desire to pour the contents of the lamp's reservoir over the thing in its box and drop the cigarette into it. The 3 red eyes glared up at him sightlessly, the ruby eyeballs reflecting murky, smoky rays of light. He realized vaguely that he'd been looking at them for a very long time, even vaguely understood that they were no longer sightless, but it did not seem of importance, of no more importance than the labored slow motion of the tentacular things that sprouted from the base of the scrawny, slowly pulsing neck. Conant picked up the pressure lamp and returned to his chair. He sat down, staring at the pages of mathematics before him. The clucking of the counter was strangely less disturbing, the rustle of the coals in the stove no longer distracting. The creak of the floorboards behind him didn't interrupt his thoughts as he went about his weekly report in an automatic manner, filling in columns of data and making brief summarizing notes. The creak of the floorboards sounded nearer. I mean, that is just juicy, sizzling stuff, and I know in the era of social media and YouTube and video games and all that stuff, sometimes people neglect or forget just how great a really cool short story or a novella or a novel can be. But as much as I love movies and as much as I love video games and as much as I love watching digital media online, there is nothing quite like the power of kind of surrendering yourself over to the voice of an author, because it's an incredibly personal thing. You have the voice of the author and you have the reader, and it's an incredibly intimate relationship, but it's also incredibly intense because the mind is the greatest screening room, as Ridley Scott has said on many occasions. And there's something about when an author has an incredibly strong storytelling voice and your imagination runs wild, it's more powerful and more potent than any video game or any movie you could ever hope to experience. But I love all the above, obviously, but I have a special place in my heart for the written word. So anyway, Who Goes There? Highly recommended. So how did we get from the short story in 1938 to the movie in 1951? Well, to start with, Howard Hawks was a voracious reader, but not only that, he surrounded himself with great writers his entire career. I would argue of all the great directors from the golden age of Hollywood, he probably did more great book adaptations than just about anybody, apart from maybe like John Huston, but he worked over and over and over again with all these incredible writers like Lee Brackett, Ben Hecht, or Charles Lederer, or Jules Furthman, or even William Faulkner. And William Faulkner, while he was writing all of his great literary masterpieces, on the side, he would work for Howard Hawks because he could work very quickly and could crank out pages at this crazy rate, which Howard Hawks absolutely loved. And sometimes Faulkner would work overtly on big movies like The Big Sleep, and sometimes he'd just do a little ghostwriting on the side. But long story short, Howard Hawks had a great respect for the written word and a great respect for incredible writers. And usually, anytime you see a picture of Howard Hawks working on a set, almost always it's Howard Hawks with the screenplay open, surrounded by like 9 or 10 other people with their screenplays open, editing, rehearsing, revising, so on and so forth. In any case, in addition to being a voracious reader, Howard Hawks was also a pretty big liar at times. He was notorious for telling tall tales, and sometimes they were mild exaggerations or embellishments, but when discussing his own career, he would, let's just say, he would never sacrifice a good story for the sake of the truth. And he claimed to Peter Bogdanovich at one point that he'd come across the story while reading a magazine during one of his delays while shooting the comedy I Was a Male War Bride, and that the short story was only 4 pages and he read it in one sitting, and from there he decided to option the story and make it into a movie, when in reality it was screenwriter Charles Lederer as well as a frequent collaborator Ben Hecht who convinced Howard Hawks to buy the rights to the story, which he did for $1,250. And this was his only venture into the wonderful world of science fiction, because Howard Hawks loved like westerns and fast-talking comedies and war movies and airplane movies. And he loved making, he was a classic genre hopper, a lot like John Carpenter. John Carpenter is called the horror master, but he's also a genre hopper. But Howard Hawks was the greatest genre hopper of them all. And it kills me that he didn't make more movies in the science fiction genre, but at least we have this one. But for this production, Howard Hawks surrounded himself with some of his most frequent collaborators, many of whom had just worked with him on Red River, a strong contender for his greatest movie. And I've got it on DVD right here. I need to upgrade to the Criterion Blu-ray at some point. But he brought back composer Dmitry Tiomkin. He got Christian Nyby, who edited Red River, to direct The Thing from Another World. And he got his DP, Russell Harlan, to shoot The Thing from Another World. So if you detect like a similar flavor to some of Howard Hawks' earlier movies, it's because it's basically the exact same crew. But Christian Nyby, he was ready to kind of evolve from being an editor to being a filmmaker, and Howard Hawks gave him his shot. But it was kind of a double-edged sword, because RKO is willing to spend $50,000 on the director's fee for The Thing from Another World, but Howard Hawks only gave Christian Nyby $5,460 of that fee, and he kept the rest for himself. And apparently this was all done as a favor to Christian Nyby so that he could join the DGA, get his Directors Guild membership card, and then launch his own career as a director moving forward. But because this movie utilizes a lot of tropes that you find in a lot of other Howard Hawks movies, that is what's opened the door to this constant discussion about who actually directed this movie. And Howard Hawks has always denied that he directed the movie. And for somebody who is known to lie from time to time, it's amazing that he would be so humble to say that Christian Nyby deserves full credit. But according to some of the actors, you get conflicting interpretations about what was going on, because Howard Hawks was the boss, but he wasn't always there. It's a little bit like the scenario on Poltergeist. Tobe Hooper directed Poltergeist, but Steven Spielberg was right down the street directing E.T. and producing Poltergeist. And you see all these pictures on the set where like Spielberg is quite literally directing over Tobe Hooper's shoulder, pointing, while Hooper's kind of glowering and frowning. And it's like, all right, Tobe Hooper deserves credit for directing that incredible movie, but Spielberg was, he was the boss. He was calling some of the shots, not all the shots. And you have a similar situation here. And so I'm going to read you a few testimonials by some of the people who worked on the movie. Like one of the film's stars, William Self, who later became the president of 20th Century Fox Television. The way he described it was, Christian was the director in our eyes, but Howard was the boss in our eyes. Hawks was directing the picture from the sidelines. Chris would stage each scene, how to play it, but then he would go over to Howard and ask him for advice, which the actors did not hear. Even though I was there every day, I don't think any of us can answer the question. Only Chris and Howard can answer the question. But according to the Thing himself, actor James Arness, this 6'7" giant who plays the creature in this movie and would later become a massive star working on Gunsmoke, a show which went on for 20 years, what he said was that Howard Hawks spent a lot of time on the set, but it was Nyby who actually directed the film. But I think the best person to listen to when it comes to answering this question is Christian Nyby himself, who in 1982 said, did Hawks direct it? That's one of the most inane and ridiculous questions I've ever heard, and people keep asking that it was Hawks' style. Of course it was. This is a man I studied and wanted to be like. You would certainly emulate and copy the master you're sitting under, which I did. Anyways, if you're taking painting lessons from Rembrandt, you don't take the brush out of the master's hands. But the good news is for us as moviegoers is that the movie kicks ass no matter who can claim credit for each individual detail. Because famously in Howard Hawks' films, like from the beginning to the end, whether you were a production assistant or working in craft service or working in transpo, if you had a good idea, he would listen. Or if you could get your idea to him, he might listen, because he knew if it was a good idea, he was totally going to claim credit for it in the long term. So he had a very open, collaborative environment. But the reason people keep bringing up Howard Hawks' direction in quotes versus Christian Nyby is that there's so many ingredients in this movie that feel like a Howard Hawks movie. Like let's start with the overlapping dialogue. Most famously, that was employed on His Girl Friday. But on a lot of Howard Hawks' movies, the dialogue was constructed in a way where the first few words in a sentence wouldn't matter, and the last few words in a sentence wouldn't really matter, because it allowed the actors to talk over each other, which created a much more realistic sounding dialogue. Or not necessarily realistic, but a much more compelling, fast-paced sense of dialogue. And obviously, His Girl Friday is the heavyweight champion of that kind of dialogue.
Well, just because you won't listen, you say I don't love you. Now you know that isn't the point at all.
What else
The point is that you never intended to be decent and live like a human being.
What's that?
All right, if that's the way you want to think.
Sebastian
I see
jumping.
what you
I'm
are
trying
now.
to concentrate.
You're just like him and all the rest.
Sure, that's what I am.
What? No, leave the rooster story alone. That's human interest.
But Howard Hawks liked that kind of dialogue because in real life, if you're hanging out with your friends, you talk over each other. You finish each other's sentences. And anyway, he was the master of overlapping dialogue, and you get a lot of it in this movie. But he was also famous for his strong Hawksian women. And what I mean by a strong Hawksian woman is the kind of woman that he was attracted to. Because he basically would cast the women that he wanted to go to bed with or would fantasize about. But the women in his movies, like the really strong Hawksian women, they tend to be very self-reliant. They tend to enjoy the company of men. They like hanging out in a masculine environment. And they have no trouble being the one woman surrounded by like 20 or 25 guys. They love chain smoking cigarettes. They enjoy going to bed with men, so on and so forth. But obviously, the perfect embodiment of the Hawksian ideal of what a woman like should be on the screen would be Lauren Bacall in movies like To Have and Have Not and The Big Sleep. Is there anything more sexy on planet Earth than the opening credit sequence to The Big Sleep, where Bogey and Bacall are lighting each other's cigarettes, and then in a not so subtle way laying those two cigarettes down side by side on an ashtray to imply all the hanky panky to come later in the movie, no pun intended. And speaking of Hawksian women, Margaret Sheridan is fucking fantastic in this movie. And she injects some much-needed sex appeal into a movie where otherwise it would just be a bunch of dudes, like, shivering in their jackets, fighting this horrible monstrosity. But she very nearly played the lead in Red River, but she got pregnant. And apparently the reason she didn't become a big star like some of the other women that Howard Hawks worked with was that she placed the value of having a family over her own career. But at least we get a taste of what might have been in The Thing from Another World.
You're much nicer when you're not mad.
Sounds promising. How about that business of beginning over again?
Well, I think I'll buy you a drink this time. I think you've earned it.
But another ingredient which adds to that overall Hawksian flavor is how, over the course of his career, Howard Hawks loved nothing more than depicting men who were absolute, like the consummate pros at their chosen profession, usually a profession that had an ingredient of danger, like whether they were pilots or cowboys or whatever. But he loved showing very rational, resourceful men going up against problems and then just through their own ingenuity and bravery and courage, overcoming those obstacles. And so with The Thing from Another World, you basically get like a lot of the characters from a movie like Only Angels Have Wings going up against this horrible monster that's threatening to take over the entire population of planet Earth. And as a fan of Howard Hawks' movies, that's just so goddamn fun because I love the rest of his career, but we never get to see those badasses from movies like Rio Bravo or Red River or Only Angels Have Wings kind of matching wits and resources with otherworldly creatures, but here we do.
Hey, Pat, this ought to work all right.
Good. Watch that cigarette, Lieutenant.
They're 1.2.
How are we going to set it on fire? Rub two sticks together?
There's a very pistol in my bag.
I'll get it. If it comes in, you wet it down. And you, Matt, touch it off. And don't miss. You two be ready in case it needs more.
I think you're right, Captain.
Oh, sure.
And speaking of Only Angels Have Wings, the movie perfectly exemplifies the attitude that a lot of Hawks' heroes have, where death is not something that they sit around and kind of like mope about or get too sad about, even if it's one of their closest friends that they love dearly.
How can you do that?
What?
Eat that steak.
What's the matter with it?
It was his.
Look, what do you want me to do? Have it stuffed?
Haven't you any feelings? Don't you realize he's dead?
Who's dead?
Yeah, who's dead?
Joe.
Joe?
Well, who's Joe?
Anybody know Joe?
But you see it in The Thing from Another World. You see it in Only Angels Have Wings. You see it in To Have and Have Not. And Jules Furthman, he was involved in a lot of those classic Howard Hawks movies as a writer, which is why you see those themes emerging over and over and over again. But one of the things that's so cool about this movie is that even as the people start to die, they don't like, oh my God, like what are we gonna do? Like they don't sit around and like descend into depression or whatever. They are men of action and they rise to the challenge, and right up to the bitter end when they destroy the creature with electrocution and so on and so forth, that they never stop working as a team, pooling their knowledge and pooling their resources. Unless, of course, you have a pencil neck egghead scientist who is threatening to undo all your hard work by taking the side of the creature. And I feel like that's one of the most interesting parts about this movie is seeing that contrast between these men of action who are veterans of World War II, and you can definitely feel that this is a post-World War II movie where all these guys, they're constantly talking about all these exotic islands that they've been to, and you have to almost put on like headphones and listen very carefully because they have these little throwaway lines about topless native girls and things like wait, what were they just saying? But then they change the subject and they move on.
You know what it reminds me of? The time I was stuck on Bulan Island with the old 97th Bomber Group. An Army nurse came ashore one day and caused just about the same disturbance as this guy from Mars has around here.
What happened to the nurse?
She liked it there.
But that's another big ingredient to this movie is that all these guys, whether they're scientists or journalists or pilots or whatever, you can tell they've all just emerged from World War II. But when it came to the depiction of the Thing in this movie, one of the big problems was that they were never able to get the makeup quite right. Because obviously the special effects for creating the Thing as described in Who Goes There, they just didn't exist in 1951. And they experimented in a bunch of different ways trying to figure out how can we kind of depict the monster. And they finally just decided on, let's just make him fucking Frankenstein's monster and make it a big, tall guy with a big head. And he'll just be scary as shit because he's just smashing through doors and smashing through walls and all that stuff. It's not remotely faithful to the source material. And actor James Arness was very embarrassed being described as like a big giant carrot. And he refused. I think he refused to even attend the premiere of the film. And he wouldn't talk about the movie later in life. But that's what they decided upon. But they were worried that if there were any close-ups in the movie, that you would be able to see how clunky the makeup was and how ridiculous it was. But luckily, Howard Hawks' movies, if they're known for one thing, it's his love of medium shots. If you're looking for close-ups in Howard Hawks' movies, you got to really sit up and pay attention because they are few and fleeting. He almost never gives you a close-up of any kind. Every single scene, it's just like following the characters around from like the middle of their thighs to above their heads. And it's like, all right, well, don't you get sick of medium shots? But they're great for just telling stories of action and keeping things moving. And because this movie is told almost exclusively in medium shots, it allows the clunky special effects to kind of hide in the background so you never really see them. But if all these stylistic tropes and ingredients were not enough to help Howard Hawks fans identify this movie as a Howard Hawks production, they even call attention to his own filmography and the dialogue of the film. And keep in mind, in 1951, this was decades before Quentin Tarantino would talk about movies in movies. But at one point in this movie, somebody's asked whether or not he can handle a particular gun that he's holding. And he said, well, I saw Gary Cooper in Sergeant York.
You know how to shoot that thing, don't you? I saw Gary Cooper in Sergeant York.
Sergeant York was one of Howard Hawks' most popular and successful movies that he ever made. So long before people were making references to movies within movies, here we have Howard Hawks calling attention to his own filmography in one of his most exciting movies. But as much as I might enjoy discussing all those Hawksian tropes, there are some key differences with this film which make it utterly unique. And if you pay careful attention, like you would think, oh, all these kind of tough-talking, resourceful heroes might dispel the atmosphere of horror. But the movie does a few subtle things which work really effectively. And it actually took John Carpenter pointing this out in an interview before I even really noticed how the technique was being employed. But throughout the movie, and John Carpenter brilliantly describes this, the movie places very heavy emphasis on doors opening and closing and click, clack, and click and clack. And it's kind of conditioning the audience over the course of an hour. Open the door, close the door, click, clack, etc. and so forth. So you kind of expect a certain rhythm to be sustained throughout the movie as they're moving throughout this outpost. But it leads to one of the best jump scares of this era because sooner or later, when one of those doors opens, there's going to be something horrible. And the first time you see the creature, which is deep, it's not the first time you see the creature. The first time the creature attacks them is deep into the movie. But sure enough, they open the door and he's standing right fucking there and shoves his arm through. And anyway, it's a seat jumper, as they say. And so it's just a brilliant bit of craft and technique where you set the audience up, you get them conditioned to a certain level of expectation, and then you throw a curveball their way.
Ready, Bob? No, but go ahead and open it.
And then every once in a while in this movie, they take a break from that classic medium shot photographic style, and they give us some bangers, some absolute Hall of Fame sequences, like the first time they try to prepare a trap for the thing, and they know it's approaching. It's almost like a scene out of like James Cameron's Aliens, where like they can see, like I think it's like a Geiger counter, but they have a meter that can detect the approaching energy or radiation or whatever the case might be. And the lights go out and they douse it with fucking kerosene and light it on fire. You're like, holy shit! Like, how did anybody survive shooting this scene? Like, I know they had stuntmen on this movie and they knew what they were doing, but like the fire just like rages completely out of control, and they're splashing kerosene and it's spreading all over the set and like the production design and that sort of thing. The scene is fucking bananas. And so horror and action sometimes can kind of clash, or they're kind of conflicting moods. Like action's very thrilling, horror is supposed to be very like upsetting or unsettling. But somehow in that scene, action and horror collide together beautifully. And I think it's the best scene or the most memorable scene from the entire movie, even though I really, really love the end of the movie when they finally decide to fry the creature with electricity. It's absolutely dynamite stuff. But goddamn, that kerosene sequence, I think it's, if you're a lover of classic science fiction, that is one for the history books. Another ingredient that really helps create the atmosphere of this movie is the astonishing score by Dmitri Tiomkin. And back in the day, there were guys like Max Steiner or Bernard Herrmann who were renowned for creating enormous bodies of work when it came to classic film scores. But Dmitri Tiomkin, he deserves to be mentioned in the same breath alongside all of them. And when you watch the movie, it sounds like they're using a theremin, which had first been used by Alfred Hitchcock on Spellbound only a few years prior. But I was reading earlier, apparently they did not use a theremin on this movie. It says here that Dmitri Tiomkin's score underlines the eerie atmosphere of much of the picture with strings and the wailing of 4 women's voices. The effect resembles that of the theremin, And if you watch a lot of science fiction movies from the 1950s, you will hear the theremin over and over again. And I've seen it demonstrated in person, but it's like this like L-shaped electronic device, and you hold out a metal rod, and depending on where you hold it, it creates certain notes, but it's just like nothing screams 50s more than the theremin. In any case, Dmitri Tiomkin, he really knocked it out of the park when it came to the music of this movie. But it's not enough to have cool music and cool photography and a rampaging monster of destruction that can smash through walls and that sort of thing. In the end, you need some drama. You need some conflict. You need some real, some real meat for the actors to sink their teeth into. And what I love about this movie is that we get three major conflicting ideologies about what to do with this incredible scientific discovery, followed by this fight to the death with this creature in this station. In the movie, it's in the North Pole. In the book, it's down in Antarctica. But within this ideological struggle, we have Captain Patrick Henry, played by Kenneth Tobey, Dr. Carrington, played by Robert Cornthwaite, and Scotty, played by Douglas Spencer. And I love how their professions kind of dictate like their worldview and their goals and their ambitions. Because Captain Patrick Henry, he's a pilot, and all he really wants is to have enough time to flirt with Nikki, smoke some cigarettes, get in some smooches, maybe a little card playing with the boys, and then take a nap. And we have Scotty. All he wants is to land the story of the century. And he just keeps seeing every opportunity to become a famous journalist, just going up in smoke.
What do you mean private? I'm going to send it to the whole world.
I wish you could, but this is Air Force information. We'll have to wait for authority to let you file a story.
Why, you've got your authority in the Constitution of the United States. For your information, it's called freedom of the press, and I'm sending a story,
Not
Captain.
from our ship, Scotty.
And Dr. Carrington, all he cares about is knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom and deeper insight. And as far as he's concerned, none of their lives matter. All that matters is the accumulation of knowledge and whatever wisdom this creature might have. And throughout the movie, they keep screwing up. Like, they blow up the fucking ship with thermite, trying to free it when they first discover it out in that incredible scene out there on the ice. Apparently, when they shot that scene, it was about 100 degrees outside, and they're all having to act like they're really cold. But that scene is just it's the stuff of science fiction legend, where you can see how the ship came in, where it sank down, and after they completely screw up and blow up the ship and the opportunity to gain all that knowledge, luckily they still find one survivor, or unluckily they still find one survivor about 100 yards away. And the same is true in the source material, the same is true in John Carpenter's film. And what's cool about John Carpenter's movie is that through the Norwegians in that movie, you can almost imagine that Norwegian crew is the crew from the thing from another world, but instead of having a happy ending, they had an unhappy ending. But you can clearly see like the baton being passed from one movie to the next, because what happens to the Norwegians, it's very similar to what happens to the crew in the original movie. So I love the way that John Carpenter was kind of tipping his hat to the original film. But as you're watching the original movie from 1951, you slowly realize, wait a second, the conflict is not between the crew and the monster. The real conflict at the core of this movie is between Captain Patrick Henry and Dr. Carrington. And this is where you get that early 50s sci-fi paranoia about the splitting of the atom, and can we trust scientists not to destroy the planet in the pursuit of knowledge and discovery? Because as we see in this movie, Dr. Carrington is using the blood of dogs in order to feed different parts of this creature, in order to grow new creatures. Like, he's in the process of breeding the creature, where it's already been established that this creature lives off the blood of others and wants nothing more than just to conquer all of planet Earth. But as far as Dr. Carrington is concerned, it's a totally favorable outcome. And you can almost hear him yearning with like jealousy and regret that the creature grew up without any sense of like feelings or like a need for sexual reproduction. It's just it's hilarious stuff, getting the insights into the way he thinks. And admittedly, he's tired and he's exhausted.
Look, on the planet from which our visitor came, vegetable life underwent an evolution similar to that of our own animal life, which would account for the superiority of its brain.
Dr. Carrington.
Its development was not handicapped by emotional or sexual factors.
By the end of the movie, he totally turns against humanity and tries to join forces with the creature. And of course, he gets what's coming to him, because the creature just smashes him aside and keeps screaming like the Hulk. But as far as Captain Patrick Henry is concerned, maybe he's a little too eager to follow orders, and maybe he's a little too quick to want to just destroy the creature and so on and so forth. But there's no denying he is the hero of this movie. He's your classic, big barrel-chested, square-jawed man of action.
Pat, I thought we were going to have a little trouble tonight.
So did I.
Well, those geniuses were really ready to tear you apart.
They're kids, most of them, like 9-year-olds drooling over a new fire engine.
And he's a total badass, and it's very easy to get on his side. But from an intellectual standpoint, I guess I sympathize with the real villain of the movie, Dr. Carrington. But once again, I feel like great science fiction and great horror should be about more than one thing at any one time. Like Stephen King always does this with his novels, where it's not just one threat. He'll complicate things by having like spin-off threats or additional dimensions. And I feel like that's one of the things that makes The Thing from Another World so fantastic, is that you have the human drama as well as the otherworldly drama, and they're all being stirred together. And the overall effect is just a fucking blast to watch. One actor I still need to mention is Dewey Martin, who plays the crew chief, because he kind of steals every single scene in which he appears. And this is a movie that is totally devoid of any like established movie stars, and they did that on purpose to keep the budget down, but also they wanted the kind of the audience to be uncertain about who is going to survive the story. But the crew chief, what I love about him is he's got like the ultimate can-do positive attitude. In spite of all this conflict that they're wrestling with and all these problems they're trying to overcome, it seems like every single situation can be solved by him just saying, all right, well, I got an idea, but somebody's got to lend me a hand. I think he says lend me a hand like 5 or 6 times.
I thought if Mr. Scott and the lieutenant would give me a hand...
I thought I was a guest. I thought an officer.
Oh, you can be ordering me around while you're carrying the other end, sir.
That'll help a lot, Sarge.
But he's always getting guys to help him out, like whatever needs to be rigged or set up or invented in order to try to survive a little bit longer. He's always there right in the middle of the action. And Howard Hawks was famous for being a big gearhead. He loved like motorcycles and cars and airplanes, and you can tell he just loved surrounding himself with like grease monkeys who really knew how to make things work. And Dewey Martin is the perfect embodiment of that kind of character.
Isn't there something we can do about it?
They're dead, and our job is to see nobody else joins them.
As for you, Doctor, you're limited to your room, laboratory, and the mess hall. This thing's finished.
Captain, you have no authority of any kind to issue such an order. No right to assume...
You better move along.
But maybe my favorite moment of the entire movie is at the very end, when the journalist is finally going to get a chance to tell his story, and he's warning the world, like the outside world, to watch the skies. And I feel like if there's a line that kind of captures that 50s paranoia better than any, it would be "Watch the Skies." And it you can feel it teeing up later 50s sci-fi classics like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which might be the most paranoid 50s sci-fi movie of them all. Like, yeah, the 50s, just a time of fear and uncertainty and anxiety, but it just sets the perfect tone about like the decade to come and all these great sci-fi movies.
Every one of you listening to my voice, tell the world, tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies, everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the sky.
The movie finally came out, and it was considered a modest success at the time. It performed a little bit better than the Day the Earth Stood Still, but I'm sure for sci-fi fans at the time who had basically been spending all their time in libraries or reading comic books up until that time, they were just relieved to have some science fiction movies to see on the big screen, because The Day the Earth Stood Still is a pretty goddamn good movie as well. And speaking of which, when did that? I might need to do a 75th anniversary review for that. Let me just check. The Day the Earth Stood Still, release date. Came out September 18th, so who knows? Maybe I'll revisit the subject of science fiction later this year. But after the movie came out, what cannot be denied is the legacy or the impact that it had on future filmmakers, because there are a lot of directors out there like John Frankenheimer or Ridley Scott or Tobe Hooper who saw this movie and were like, holy crap, and it blew their minds. And even before John Carpenter decided to do his remake, I think it's kind of a mistake to call The Thing from 1982 a remake, when really it's just a fresh adaptation of the same source material. But however you want to describe it, before he made The Thing, he was already tipping his hat to The Thing from Another World in Halloween in 1978, because at least on 3 occasions in that movie, you see The Thing from Another World playing on TV screens, and there's this kid who's watching the movie, and I think what made me love this movie so much is that Halloween was so unsettling and disturbing to me as a little kid, but when you see those scenes in the movie, and you're seeing everybody like holding their arms out and standing in that classic scene in that big circle where they're trying to measure the saucer, there's something about those scenes that are even more terrifying when they're on a little screen in the corner of this crazy horror movie. So obviously, yeah, John Carpenter loved and adored this movie, but it's just yet another way of kind of showing his appreciation for this movie. And so I probably saw those scenes from The Thing from Another World contained within Halloween decades before I finally saw the movie in its entirety. But I love Halloween. I love John Carpenter's film, The Thing. Yeah, both movies, The Thing from Another World and The Thing, have a very special place in my heart. And they're very different movies in style and tone, But I feel like between the source material, the first movie, and the subsequent movie, it's just a treasure trove of delights for sci-fi fans, horror fans, fans of action, fans of great overlapping dialogue, fans of tough, resourceful characters. Because if there's one, I guess, bit of overlap between the 1951 film and the 1982 film, you can tell that John Carpenter also was trying to make all of his men your classic Hawksian archetypes, where they're very resourceful and knowledgeable, and maybe some of them are like, you know, drunks or stoners or whatever the case might be. But in the subsequent adaptation, it's not a one-to-one adaptation of the source material. You can definitely tell that John Carpenter is bringing some ingredients over from the Howard Hawks / Christian Nyby productions. So yeah, I just love all three, and I could talk about all three of them indefinitely. But I think at this point, maybe I've said enough. And obviously, I could go on for another hour just talking about the John Carpenter film. But I can tell that my voice is starting to fade, so maybe it's time to start editing some of this video footage and including some clips and actually trying to put this video to bed. And I could talk about John Carpenter more at a later date, and I'll definitely be talking a lot more about Howard Hawks at a later date. I definitely want to do like a video celebrating my top 10 favorite movies by Howard Hawks on this channel, because I think this is the first time I've ever actually celebrated Howard Hawks on this channel, although I did some videos years ago talking about some of my favorite movies that I saw as a result of some of the recommendations by other filmmakers. I know that like movies like Rio Bravo have come up on this channel in the past. In any case, talking about Howard Hawks on this channel is long overdue. And if you're curious about some of the other directors on my Mount Rushmore, the faces change every once in a while, but usually it's Orson Welles, Howard Hawks, Sam Peckinpah, sometimes Sergio Leone, sometimes John Huston, sometimes David Lynch. It's really tough to limit myself to just 4 directors, but when it comes to the career of Howard Hawks, I mean, between Scarface and 20th Century and Bringing Up Baby, Only Angels Have Wings, To Have and Have Not, The Big Sleep, Red River, Rio Bravo. I mean, he made tons of good movies that I love. Or His Girl Friday. Holy shit, I haven't even mentioned His Girl Friday. In any case, yeah, Howard Hawks, he's one of the greats, and even though he is not the director of this movie, it is still a Howard Winchester Hawks production, and it was an absolute privilege celebrating the movie on this channel today. And I look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts down in the comments below. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell, becoming a member, all that good stuff. And I'll be back at you in the near future with more rants on film history in the not so distant future. So thanks again for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.